The system of education, the traditional system of education, frankly, was set well over 100 years ago. It was set in the middle of the 19th century to deliver on a set of outcomes that were relevant for the middle of the 19th century, and were probably relevant until sometime in the early or middle part of the 20th century. They certainly are not outcomes that are relevant today. And as I first wrote, probably 7 or 8 years ago, if we can imagine the education system like a computer system, we have changed the hardware of the system, we've changed the software of the system, we've changed the desired outcomes that we're trying to achieve for our students, but we've never gone back and changed the fundamental operating system of education.
Thank you for joining the Change I Am Possible, which is India's first future tech meets sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Grant Lichtman, who is an author, speaker, and an internationally recognized thought leader working towards transforming K-12 education. So really appreciate you, Grant, taking time and being a part of a humble effort to educate, create awareness about what's happening in the field of education and healthcare and stuff like that. So really appreciate this. So why don't we start with COVID? Because of COVID, I feel that the entire world has been upended. So far, our education system as such was extremely traditional and everything was, going without any problem. But then COVID has completely changed everything. I have a 6.5-year-old boy who was for the longest time going to a brick and mortar traditional school, and I was paying huge fees over there. But then just last year, I moved into an online school, and I'm seeing great benefits. So as a leader in the education space, how do you think has COVID impacted the education industry?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. And yes, COVID is the big elephant in the room today and has been now for almost 2 years. The first thing I would say is in your preface there, you said everything had been going along well until COVID came along. And I would challenge that. In education, things had not been going along well. There had been a lot of need for transformation in the education space, and COVID was really an accelerator. COVID was something that threw gasoline on an incipiently burning fire. COVID has been incredibly challenging and difficult for educators worldwide, stressful in ways that we have not seen. The spring of 2020, which now seems a very, very long time ago, right as the pandemic was kicking off, I, like many others, were involved in large national and international Zoom meetups trying to assess how this was going to impact schools. And there was a remarkable level of optimism that this was finally going to be the thing that really provided an opportunity for schools to change dramatically, and the impetus for schools to change dramatically. And I wrote an article then that was, I think, pragmatic, where I argued that the metaphor that I used was that when people are in a stormy sea, the first thing they're going to do is reach for the nearest life raft. And that's what we've seen is that rather than many school systems using this opportunity of COVID to significantly transform themselves, many are just trying to get back to the norms that they had before. And those norms were not necessarily serving the vast majority of our students well when we think about the challenges that they're going to be experiencing in their future, as exemplified by things that come along like COVID, which are going to be more of a norm than in the past. So, and for some schools, they will take advantage of the lessons learned from COVID and make those transformations that we all want to see, or many of us want to see. And others will default back to the norm, back to, frankly, a comfort zone that probably didn't exist in the first place, but nevertheless is deemed more comfortable.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think you rightfully pointed that, there'll be a certain section of the educators and education system who understand the opportunity. I mean, when I said that things were going normal, what I meant was the education system was crying out for transformation. It was crying out for innovation, because I think all legacy traditional industries function in a certain way, and they're averse to change. Change has been brought in by these young edtech pioneers, or people who are looking for trying to create a dent in the education system. Because at least here in India, we have been stuck with 100-year-old legacy education system given to us by the Britishers, and it's rote learning. The students over here, they just study, they take in information from one year throughout from the other, and when they sit for exams, they're just mugging up, and they don't really know the context, or why they're doing that. So I'm seeing this little glimmer of hope of the education being completely upended rather than going for the bandage solutions. So someone who's been vested in the space over the 2 years period, since we are still trapped in home because this new Omicron thing, what has been the learnings and insights that you would like to share with educators and education institutes and students? Because everyone has been transformed.
Sure, sure. Well, the learning and insights, it's hard to summarize quickly. There are three books in the shelf behind me, three books that I've written in the last 8 or 9 years about that. But I think I'll try to summarize at the very highest level, and exactly within the context that you just laid the question. Again, COVID has been an accelerant. COVID is not the reason that we need to change. COVID has just provided an acceleration opportunity and realization, or made the realization much more clear that we need to change the system of education. As you said, in India, as well as in most other countries around the world, the system of education, the traditional system of education, frankly, was set well over 100 years ago. It was set in the middle of the 19th century to deliver on a set of outcomes that were relevant for the middle of the 19th century, and were probably relevant until sometime in the early or middle part of the 20th century. They certainly are not outcomes that are relevant today. And as I first wrote, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 years ago, if we can imagine the education system like a computer system, we have changed the hardware of the system, we've changed the software of the system, we've changed the desired outcomes that we're trying to achieve for our students, but we've never gone back and changed the fundamental operating system of education. And to imagine that we can deliver on a different outcome without changing the fundamental operating system, how the curriculum that we use, the pedagogy that is more universally applied, the way we use the resources of physical space and time and training and professional development, assessment and evaluation, without changing those, we're not going to substantively change the outcomes. We're asking our educators, and we want our educators to prepare our students to live in a world that, there's a term we now use called VUCA world, VUCA, a world that is vastly more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous than it ever has been in human history. And COVID is just one example of that. And VUCA world is not going to become more calm in the future. It's going to become more VUCA in the future. And so that's the world we want to prepare our students for. And we have to change the fundamental operating system of schools in order to achieve those different outcomes. We were starting to see that transformation well before COVID, really probably in the first decade of this century. We've seen an acceleration of that worldwide. And with COVID, all of a sudden we were forced to really reimagine the operating system of school, weren't we? Probably you and with your children and almost every other family around the world. And so we want to take lessons from this COVID experience. We want to apply it to the evolution and transformation that was already in process and say, okay, now what are the ways that we can achieve these different learning outcomes and prepare our students better for the future that they're going to inherit?
The metaphor you used was profound, because computers, I mean, if you imagine it as a computer, we're constantly iterating and there's been changes, but the education system seems to be stuck in the past. But I think slowly and steadily things are improving, and the ones who uh, are moving with the time are gonna really reap the benefits. Now, there the online community of education, it's growing rapidly. There's something called as moocs, massive open online courses, and there are these, some of the top institutes in the world are giving away education almost for free or at low cost. So it's something which is unimaginable, because even 15 years back this was not really possible. But today, I think the only thing that stops an individual from learning or gaining knowledge is the desire and intent, because most of the education is out there on the internet, almost free or at low cost. Do you see that these online platforms getting more relevant compared to these brick and mortar education system?
Educators know that that learning has two real components. One is a translational component, and another is a relational component. Translation is we're moving knowledge from one source to another. It might be from a professor to a student. It's the professor standing at the front of the class lecturing, or the teacher standing at the front of class lecturing, handing information, as you said earlier, to students. And that's what happens in a Mooc, something that is very non-personal. The other element of learning is relational, where the student is relating to the teacher, the student is relating to the material, to the subject, people are relating to each other, and all educators know, this is black letter law, the relational part of learning is vastly more important in terms of long-term knowledge and retention, et cetera, than translational learning. And so MOOCs were essentially the ultimate attempt at increasing translational efficiency. And they just didn't work very well for the vast majority of students. So having said that, online learning in general has accelerated dramatically, and has accelerated really dramatically in the last couple of years because of the position we've been in with the pandemic. And it is absolutely clear that there was a lot of online learning taking place before the pandemic. There's been an increase in that, and there will continue to be an increase. And why? Because now we have technologies like you and I are using right now that can be truly relational, relation-rich learning through technology. And this did not exist for the majority of consumers in the world, certainly 10 years ago, and for the majority 5 or 4 years ago. If the pandemic had hit in 2010, learning would have looked very, very different over the last
Exactly.
2 years, because we did not have this sort of capability. So I believe that there's a very strong movement toward, and there will continue to be a place for virtual learning, hybrid learning, various types of online learning. But the most important thing is that we have to have a relational component, so that I, as the teacher, you as a student, we can relate to each other as human beings, whether it's in a virtual or a physical space. And I hope that there is always a role for people to meet together as human beings, hopefully face to face as much as possible. But there will always be a role for that now virtual component, where the efficiencies are much greater than having to build a school and having everybody come together at one place physically in time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, maybe this would have, you rightfully pointed out, maybe it would have, if it would have happened maybe 10 years back, I mean, things would have been completely different. Today, technology is playing such a huge role in creating these relationships, I mean, creating these connections. But a human connection, the physical meet, I mean, it's very, very difficult to replace. I mean, there are technologies like the virtual reality and the metaverse, and people are talking about creating these virtual worlds, and these where, with these holographic technologies and things like that. But I don't think there a physical education or a teacher will ever get replaced, because I think that's the core of the education system. So yeah, would you like to unpack lifelong learning? Because there are, I mean, it's an extremely simple term, and the term, the word itself says that, I mean, we have to become lifelong learners, but it's very difficult to wrap your head around it. Would you like to unpack lifelong learning and what do you mean?
Well, I think it's something that a lot of educators are trying to understand what that means. But I do think we know what some components are. I've written, and colleagues of mine have very strongly suggested that if we look out 10, 15 years, it's very hard to imagine that this thing called quote unquote school is something that we will be restricted to a physical place that we go to for 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, or 6 days a week for 36 weeks per year for 15 years of our lives. School is going to much more be a place that we go to when we need learning, to learn what we need, for as long as we need to in our lives. There's no reason that learning should or will stop at a certain age. And that will involve a lot of virtual technologies and virtual learning. I think one of the very important technologies, and I started writing about this 8 or 9 years ago, when we first saw real investment going into virtual reality. If we go back to this idea of translational versus relational learning, what we're doing now across Zoom and ultimately virtual reality are really the first manifestations of true relation-rich learning via technology that we've ever seen. The idea that a set of students in San Diego can meet up with a professor in Mumbai, or that a set of students in Mumbai can meet up with a set of students in San Diego and have a relation-rich discussion, and whether they're meeting just as we are to discuss or whether they're going to build a robot together using VR is incredibly powerful. And it calls into question why we need some of the bricks and mortar schools, and it definitely calls into question the boundaries of a classroom. A physical classroom is no longer going to be this, 5 meters by 5 meters or whatever it is with a teacher and a set of students. And so I think that virtual reality certainly is an absolute game changer for education. I hope that in the future we don't have students who spend their entire day wearing this headset and never contacting another physical human being individually. We want people to be able to shake hands and hug each other and be in the same space. But virtual reality is a true relation-rich technology that will completely disrupt the educational operating system, and there's no turning back on that.
Right. Yeah. So I completely endorse and double whatever you said. Virtual reality, I think, is a technology or a tool which will give us immersive learning, immersive experiential learning, because I think the only way we learn is when we experience things, when we tinker around with things, break things and build it, and that's the only way we learn. Now, at least here in India, our education system is extremely structured. It's 9 till 6, and the student is loaded with these books and bags, and it's this geography, maths, physics, when a student could be liking completely something else. So we are not pushing the student to becoming good or best at what he is. We are burdening a student with a whole lot of things which is least of his interest. So I hope that with virtual reality coming in, there is a shift of how we educate or children. And you rightfully pointed out, I mean, why cannot I access a teacher from America or China why can't we create a collaborative world, a collaborative school? So virtual reality offers you that, the metaverse offers you that we could create. I'm sorry, I think you want to
Yes,
say something.
yes. Virtual reality offers us that, but we can also achieve that with zero technology, because that ability to be a lifelong learner, that ability to be an experiential learner, we have known the value of that for well over 100 years. As I traveled around, when I first traveled around the country and wrote my book here, Ed Journey, when I traveled around the country by myself in my Prius for 3 months and visited 69 schools, the one biggest takeaway from that effort was that nothing that I saw that was pointed toward the future of education would have been new or improved upon the teachings of John Dewey and Maria Montessori from the early parts of the 20th century, where Dewey essentially taught us that great learning is founded on experience, which leads to some kind of passion or interest, which leads to engagement, which leads to learning. And you can do that by digging in your garden, or by walking outside, or by having a rich discussion, or by tinkering in the maker space, or by many other things, some of which need a school, some of which we found during the pandemic. Teachers found that their students could do, oh, you know what, we can do science in our own backyards without any laboratory. And it's a very rich experience. And so this is not something that we need technology for. In fact, often technology just gets in the way or is window dressing. So the fundamental transformation that K-12 education, K-16 education has been trying to go through now for this last 20 years is to go back to where we were 100 years ago, with the lessons of those great educational philosophers of the progressive era who said, no, you don't learn best by sitting in a desk, being handed information and being expected to regurgitate it on an exam. You learn it, and you learn to become a lifelong learner by experiencing, engaging, creating, collaborating, all those things that somehow we thought of now as 21st century skills. They're not 21st century skills. They've been always the skills of lifelong learning that create successful outcomes for students and people in the professional workplace and personal workplaces. So we just have to keep in mind that this is not anything new. We're just finally reawakening to lessons that we knew and forgot over the latter part of the 20th century.
I think you said something really profound. We learn, we don't need technology. We tinker around, we step out in the garden, we do things, and we learn. I think, that's the organic way of learning. And somehow we have missed out on the richness of a past. I mean, there were these awesome painters, awesome artists, the 16th and 18th century, but somehow we have regressed. We have lost that. And you rightfully pointed out, I think we need a right balance. I think the world is now trying to find answers because of the way the things were actually wrong. At least here in India, the education system is really expensive. We have an 83,000 crore student debt, and it's just being piled on. The education system, even post-COVID, instead of trying to create relief for families and students, is not changing. So I think that's the reason there's this tug of war between, oh, should I leverage technology because it's offering me better quality education or cheaper education, versus, I mean, taking the time and effort and learning from life itself, learning from interaction with family and friends, learning from playing, learning from digging into our past and taking that up and seeing how we can build a better world, an equitable world. So there are so many wrongs. We all look up to billionaires like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, and everybody wants to be that. Nobody is trying to create a world which can be more equitable and just for all. I think that's the problem, and I guess that's the reason we create students who who even after becoming billionaires are deeply suicidal and depressed. So there is something wrong with the education which needs to be corrected. To someone who's been invested in the space and pioneer in the K-12 education space, what do you think is the way forward for the education? Because there's some really cool things happening, at least from from what I see. I've seen some really interesting thing. Like for example, Finland, there's no exams over there whatsoever. Then there is technology which is being leveraged, AR, VR, artificial intelligence, personalized learnings, and things like that. What, according to you, is the way forward for the education industry?
Well, so first of all, I don't think there is one way forward. I think that what we are seeing is a strong differentiation in the education market. The same thing that's right for a student in Finland is not necessarily right for the student of a struggling family in Mumbai, or a stockbroker's child in New York, or a child on the Native American reservation in the United States. So I think there are many ways forward. I think that there are some similarities that are important to all of these models, and we've touched on some of them. So one of them clearly is a much more student-centered learning environment. Learning has been very teacher-centric and subject-centric, and that's not the way the world works. The world is not parsed into 7 subjects that you learn in 50-minute blocks. The world is a naturally interdisciplinary place, and it's a place in which a student learns best by trying and failing and trying again and building muscle memory. I mean, the best cricket players in the world don't become the best cricket players by walking into a classroom and somebody diagramming for them how to be a good cricket player. They go out and they play cricket, don't they? And they learn how to bat and pitch and all those things that I'm not actually terribly familiar with because I don't understand cricket. But I think you understand what I'm saying. So one is a much more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary set of curricula. The second one is a much more student-centered pedagogy, where students are part of the process of inquiry. They're part of the process of setting up problems, finding problems, which is vastly more important than solving problems in an intellectual process. It's much more experiential. It is a learning system that is not bound by the physical boundaries of campus, and those boundaries can be made more permeable and can be penetrated by technology, as we've discussed, or they can just be made more permeable by students going out and learning in and with their communities. So we're starting to see this in many countries as a movement away from that sort of rigid, everybody works at the same pace, learning the same bit of information at the same time and moving along the assembly line. So I don't think there's anything new here. Certainly nothing new from COVID. We've known what the future looks like. And now I think we're accelerating toward it a little bit more quickly than we were 2 years ago.
Great learning for the students and nurturing them towards becoming lifelong learners of sorts. Because what happens, the relationship between a student and an institute is only till the student graduates. After that, the student is on its own. But there are changing model. Like for example, there's this online coding school called Lambda, which I believe has got a really good model. So they don't charge anything to the students. It's a coding school. They don't charge anything. What they do is that the entire education is free, and they handhold them till they get a job. Once they get a job, only once their salary hits a certain threshold, then they take a certain percentage from the students. So it's like a partnership which they're building, which is lifelong. So there are these really interesting innovations happening in the space of education. Has there anything which has been which has caught your attention, has excited you when it comes to education innovation?
Well, I think that example is a fabulous example, and those have been going on here. I know, probably 8 or 10 years ago, we first saw those coding boot camps crop up in Silicon Valley with different types of financing models. Sometimes the school ended up taking their revenue from the companies that hired the students that got their coding experience. And in something like coding, and I would even argue in some disciplines around things like engineering, where it's very possible to learn a lot about certain things remotely and to demonstrate mastery remotely and to not have to go to a bricks and mortar facility. Some of my good engineer friends would say, well, wait, we want to build things in a laboratory together. I completely agree. Some of those will be more possible in virtual reality in the future. So I think for some things, absolutely, there's this very powerful role for these very innovative, different types of learning experiences that are extremely valid. So I think that there are many, many different uh, types of learning that need to take place, and I see great schools of the future will be offering and will need to offer these different modalities.
Right. If educators, institutes who would want to reach out to you, where do they get in touch with you?
Everything that I do is on my website, www.grantlichtman.com. I write a blog that I've been a little less of a blogger the last year, it seems, than I have in the past. But all of my talk, a lot of my talks, articles, podcasts, things like that, I'll obviously put this podcast on my website. My books, et cetera, are there, and I'm always happy to talk with folks anywhere from any part of the world who are interested in moving forward the transformation of education. I'm fortunate at my age to be able to do what I want to do with whom I want, and I'm always happy to collaborate for informal chats with anybody, especially in the great nation of India, who are where you're going through these struggles with very, very important challenges, and can be such a model for other countries in the world.
Lovely. Thank you, Grant, for taking time and being part of the show and sharing your insights on the education industry, the wrongs, the rights, and where the future of education industry could go. Would you like to possibly summarize or maybe add on to what could be the ideal future of education? The STEM, STEAM, coding. Yeah. What are your views?
Yeah, I think that a point of emphasis is that we have known for millennia what constitutes great learning. In the West, we use the example of Socrates or Plato, and in India, there were the sages of millennia ago who taught their students the important elements of your culture, of faith, of philosophy, of mathematics, of science that go back thousands of years. Those students learned well. They met the challenges of their time, and we have to remember that those are the ideals. The ideal is not to pass an exam. The ideal is not to go to a particular college. As you said, the ideal is not to get a particular salary in a particular profession. Most of those professions aren't going to exist when some of these kids that are just coming into school today, yours are 6 or 7 years old, they aren't going to exist when they're out of college. So we know how to create great learning. And what we have to do now is we have to transform our organizations, our educational organizations, back to focus on what creates great learning outcomes. And the good news is we absolutely know how to do this. It's a question of will and focus and determination. And we will get there. Whether we'll get there in my lifetime across the world, I somewhat doubt because I'm a pragmatist. But many schools under very difficult circumstances have already achieved this transformation, and it's a wonderful thing to see. And so I encourage people and their listeners to look at those models and analogs of what has worked for schools around the world in very difficult situations, not privileged situations, and see that that students can become passionate learners. They can gain these tools of lifelong learning, and frankly, everybody's a whole lot happier with that sort of system than the one that we think of as more traditional. So there's a lot of reason for optimism and to move forward, and I guess that's how I'd like to leave folks, with that sense of optimism. And yes, we will get through the pandemic. Hopefully with fewer deaths in the future, but we will get through it, and education will evolve in order to meet those post-pandemic challenges.
Lovely. What a note to end on. We'll get through it, and yeah, the education system looks completely bright. Yeah. So thank you for being part of the podcast. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye bye. Thank you. I really appreciate this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.